Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome back to One American's Perspective tonight. The first episode I did, or the last episode I did, rather, with a good buddy of mine, Nick Rogers, went well. So I wanted to do it again with an even smarter guy this time. So I brought on my oldest friend, Shaun Finn, who lives in Florida, has a very unique background and set of experiences that I wanted to get him on here and at least kind of tap into a little bit of that. When I asked Shaun what it is that he wanted to talk about, knowing that he could discuss, any multitude of topics with a significant amount of depth to them. One of the first things he said to me and challenge really was one of my early videos and a foundational premise of this channel is that I'm trying to seek truth, universal truth, being a set of facts or principles that is grounded in objective reality, independent of any one or multiple people's ability to alter it because of their perceptions or misperceptions. And Shaun, based on his background that I'll let him get into in a little bit, challenges that notion, which I think is awesome because, that if you cannot agree on a set of principles at a base level, and your premise is faulty, then you can never build up from there. So you're building on unshaky ground. So to help kind of solidify what I mean by truth and hopefully make it more clear to some of the viewers, I'm going to have Shaun do what he does best, which is really think deeply about some of the most important principles and tenets of what I would consider truth, and maybe some of the shortfalls, and something that I can learn from. So Shaun, welcome to the channel. Go ahead, and if you don't mind, just giving a little bit of your background and maybe help the viewers understand why your perspective might be unique amongst Americans, especially today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Thanks for the kind words of praise. They're far too kind. Um, yeah, I guess, yeah, I definitely have a kind of a unique experience. Everybody has a unique experience, but I've spent some time studying kind of Eastern philosophies, Buddhism in particular, and even spent some time living and practicing Zen Buddhism at a few American um, Shoto Zen temples, which Japanese um, Zen Buddhism. Um, about 3 or 4 years through various temples, and probably over a decade now of practicing meditation and studying Eastern uh, religions or philosophies, if you want to use those words. That might be uh, helpful. And yeah, I guess that's one of the things you were speaking of, just kind of having a different background and different kind of um, perspective or a worldview that is obviously. I was, like you said, we kind of grew up down in South Florida. We have some similar experiences there, so it was interesting to kind of go into a different um, religions or ways of life or philosophies that kind of came out of a different Western mindset. So while I don't want to say that I'm an authority on speaking to Eastern ideas or Buddhism or philosophies from those cultures and places and times. But I have spent some time exploring them and practicing them and reading about them. So I'd be happy to share, some of the different perspectives and nuances I have when I come to a subject of, objective truth or ultimate truth, something like that. Some of the experiences and things I've learned along the way might add different perspectives to the conversation. So I'm happy to
Yeah,
share.
and that's really my hope, is because when you think about uh, ideological differences, you don't get, seemingly on the surface anyway, and the way I think a lot of our cultures understand them, having spent some time in Asia and spent some time studying Buddhism and Taoism and Zen ideologies myself. Um, you think that they're on opposite ends of the spectrum from what we would consider the classical Western world, founded in Judeo-Christian beliefs, and really moved along during the Renaissance and then the Industrial Revolution to where we have now in America, and that are really at the groundwork principles, and we look at them as very fundamentally different from those ancient texts and philosophies and ideologies predating the Judeo-Christian ones.
Right, right.
amongst China and Japan and Southeast, Southwest Asia. So with that, what when kind of diving right into that, and I understand, there's no way we're
Yeah,
going to get to bottom of this pit. So we'll just kind of
yeah,
manage expectations
yeah.
up front. But off the top, what do you think are some major tenets of what we might call Eastern thoughts or philosophies? Whether that be Taoists and Buddhism. Um, if I could lump them all together,
Sure.
I'm
Yeah,
sure they have
yeah,
their nuanced
yeah.
differences.
Yeah. The first thing that comes up is, again, just the things that come up with what's coming up in my mind doesn't mean that they're prioritized higher or lower, or even the idea
Of
of
course.
major tenets is like, oh, but
Mm,
what are some opening conversation? What are some different sets of ideas? It was interesting when you spoke about the idea of the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Um, One thing in my experience is Western thought is very polarized, yes or no, um, true or false, good and evil. Uh, and there's benefits to that, right? There's you and there's me. There's two sides, and that can really miss the mark in a lot of ways too. And I think that's one of the appeals of Eastern religions. As the 20th and 21st century, kind of Western scholars have kind of gone and looked into some of the teachings that are available, and the Indian subcontinent, from China and Japan, Korea, the various nations and cultures and civilizations over thousands of years. Um, that in kind of not to bring it up as an opposite, but that in the symbol that's coming up, that's kind of, it's almost cheesy to bring up, but kind of the yin and yang symbol.
mm, mm,
Um, yin and yang, yin and yang. It's there's the black and the white, which have this idea of opposites, right? Darkness, light. What are good, evil. What there we live in this world of opposites, right? Um, Contrast is how our minds operate, right? When you're just imagine a really easy um, kind of everyday, Westerner. Imagine driving your car, right? You're driving in your lane and you're going forward. There's nothing in front of you. The fact that there's nothing there, you're kind of safe to go, right? And the assumptions that we're navigating that road with. If there's something there, that's a contrast, right? And that helps us to navigate. So I don't want to put this idea of like contrast of good and bad and black and white is a bad thing. Like it helps us navigate our world, right? Every little decision we're making, where our minds are doing, we're contrasting, and we're comparing uh, these differences that we see in our uh, perceptual field, be it sight, smell, emotional states. Um, the interesting thing to me is Western ideals can kind of fall into this good and evil, good or bad,
yeah.
truth or falsity.
An oversimplification of
Right,
multifaceted
right,
variables in
right,
order to be able to make a decision to move forward.
right, right.
And you might miss
And
some of the nuance.
the subtleties of life, right? The nuance, right? Like
Mm,
um, every individual, every individual instance, every moment in life has its own richness to it. And one of the appeals of Buddhism and Taoism, and kind of these Eastern thoughts, is kind of falling away from that conceptual view of the world, because we do have this very powerful mind that can conceptualize. We can have these words, we can have this conversation, we can have this dialogue, and we can get caught in this intellectual pit and kind of miss life, right? The kind of happenings of life, even by talking about it, and um, you can kind of miss something that the words cannot encapsulate. Um, words are a
mm,
finite entity, right? Um, and the world is infinite, right? So to a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? Well, the world is worth an infinite amount of words, right? So it's like How much can we talk about it versus uh, kind of living and engaging in the world and having those kind of
Mhm.
complement one another as opposed to kind of get in the way of one another.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know it can kind of get obtuse there,
Mhm.
and it's
Well, if
interesting.
I'm hearing you right, and I agree with this, it's almost like in an Eastern ideology, there's a recognition of the the infinite variables and the ways to see things and to do things and the amount of things and what even a thing is. And there's an
Right.
embracing of that concept within, it seems like to me, within the Eastern tradition. Within the Western tradition, it is almost a scramble sometimes to categorize as effectively and efficiently as possible.
Atomize the
So that,
universe and create some
yes,
Newtonian model that we can then
yes,
predict. Right,
so that we can understand it. So there's a sense
right.
of almost a control on the Western hand, like a desire to control, at least by way of understanding, which is a sense of control, versus the embracing in the Eastern tradition of a lack of control, or an understanding that you don't really have any control. Is that kind of
I
make
think I
sense?
think some of those flavors can be there, but I'll also say it's universally human to try and control. One of the things
Mm-hmm.
that in my studying of Buddhism speaks to the fact that our minds will kind of grasp things, right? It will try and understand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and Zen is famous for having these koans, right? These like very funny, odd, paradoxical quips and sayings. And there's something that's supposed to kind of break into your consciousness to, you know,
Right.
help you enlighten you to the moment or something like that. Um, and then it's also, the Zen school I studied in, it's, you sit and stare at a white wall for a couple hours a day.
Mm.
It's
Yeah, that
like,
might be some form of torture. I'm gonna have to check the
yeah,
Geneva Conventions
yeah,
if I found it too.
yeah. And it's interesting, if you go back historically, and there's been some scholars that have done this research of why do you do wall sitting? Buddhism kind of evolved in subcontinent of India 2,500 years ago, and then moved over to China 5, 6, 700 years later, kind of unsure of the timeline of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then was in China for 1,000 or so years, and then 1,500 years, and then it went over to Japan in about the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, give or take.
Yeah.
Um, and the Chan school that became the Zen school, Chan in China, Zen in Japanese, they have this tradition of wall sitting, and it just for hundreds of years, it's you sit on your mat a couple feet away from the wall, and you just look at the wall. Um, and one thing that's interesting, some of the scholars that have done some research on this is as to why that developed. They There's the idea of, well, perhaps it was maybe not meant so literal, that um, it was about sitting and looking at the walls of your mind, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
concepts that your mind puts around the world, right? And kind of using that as a metaphor of just looking at
Mm-hmm.
those walls to see,
Mm-hmm.
what's on the other side of that wall, or why is that wall there? Our mind puts those walls up there, and how does that influence our day-to-day life?
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is just kind of an interesting kind of story. Again, I don't know which one's historically accurate, and
Yeah.
nor it can matter, and it also doesn't matter. I mean, um, it's more so about kind of an analytical view of the world, and then, excuse me, you're kind of always a scientist, and you're kind of just observing the world, and then taking note of how that feels and how your experience is affected, and then kind of
Yeah.
adjusting course uh, to what
Yeah.
extent you can.
That actually, so by saying that, how you're taking in all this sensory data
Mhm.
and being very self-aware, that's when I think about kind of, and I totally agree, and I don't think of another symbol, and it might be, uh, it might be cliche, but cliches are cliches because
For
they're
a reason,
often
yeah.
used because they're true and useful. But the yin and the yang of the East and the Western mentalities is like they're circling and they're necessary for one another, and they have a little bit of each other in them. And when I think of how the application of them, when I think of Eastern ideologies, I think they're very useful for looking inward and figuring out how to deal with yourself and the way
Mhm.
you're emoting and how you're interacting with yourself, how you view yourself. And then I find kind of from the spiritual Judeo-Christians at the foundation of the Western world, uh, that methodology most useful in how to deal with the world around you.
Mhm.
So the external and the internal,
Mhm.
and there's kind of that yin and yang balance there, where I think one is, at least for me personally, has served better for dealing with my own emotions and fears and whatnot, and the other
Right.
is dealing with the the cornucopia of things that other people and other creatures or things
Yeah.
external to myself bring to me.
Let me cut you off to just to play a game to kind of dive into
Mm,
it. You know,
please.
where is that wall between internal and external, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, it's really easy to encapsulate and say internal Zen or Buddhism, or and external these
Mm-hmm.
Judeo-Christian worlds, or whatever, any XYZ
Right.
view, whatever you want to say. It's just it's interesting how our mind naturally creates that, right? And it can
Mm-hmm.
have there's benefits. Like I said, when you're driving a car, it's good to know I'm in my car and they're in their car. Because if you don't know that, accidents happen,
You
right?
crash.
Right.
Yes.
So it's not throwing out um, the dualities of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Or
and
the categories that we bucket them into.
right. And it's also kind of looking beyond, like one thing, a little one. So it's like the phrase, another cliche, two sides of the same coin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I could describe a quarter to you right now. You can picture it in your head, right? What are the two sides
Mm-hmm.
of the coin? Heads and tails, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about the third side, the kind of ridge around the edge?
Right.
It's a silly little metaphor right there,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like even just in our conceptualization of like two sides of the same coin,
Yeah, we miss
which
something
is
that could be a key component.
right, and that even that little phrase is something that's trying to cut through the duality in our minds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that phrase misses the point, which is it's
Mm-hmm.
just it's very
Yeah.
meta. It's kind of funny at that point.
Yes.
Another one is an interesting one. There's like, do mountains shape rivers, or do rivers
Mm-hmm.
shape mountains?
Yeah.
Right?
The old
Because
chicken or the egg.
right, rivers are flowing through a mountain based on the mountain, but
Mm-hmm.
over hundreds of thousands of years, rivers
Yeah.
are cutting into the mountain, shaping the mountain. And again, not that these are like there's not really anything to these little sayings, but they make us they kind of shift our perspective, just a little pivot, right? And
Mm-hmm.
our minds love to fall into, you know, hard, solid, what is this? Every step you take, right? You
Yeah.
want to know the ground is there. When you're walking up a set of stairs in the middle of the night and you think
Mm-hmm.
there's one more step and there's not a step, right? It
Mm-hmm.
scares the heck out of you, right?
Yep.
Our minds don't like that. Our minds like to know what's there. And our brains are, hardwired to kind of,
To find
uh,
solid ground, to use your analogy, to
and
find
they
solid
hack
ground.
they kind of
Mm-hmm.
hack our world. You know what I mean? Um,
Mm-hmm.
we're always looking for like patterns and kind of shortcuts to
Yep.
describe those patterns, because it takes a lot of energy to look around the world, right? You'd go,
Right. Yeah.
anxious. You'd be too much
Mm-hmm.
going on. So Buddhism
Right.
kind of acknowledges that we have this mind that's always talking and acknowledge. It's funny. I was a couple minutes before our call started. I was getting ready a little bit early, and I had, I don't know, 10 minutes or so, and I'm kind of pacing around, saying, "Oh, I got everything set up. Am I good to go?" And I had an extra couple of minutes, and I was like, "Oh, what should I do?" And we are going to talk about, you know, um, I was going to share some of my perspective with Zen and something like that. I was like, "Oh, why don't I just sit for a couple of minutes?" I sat and meditated for 5 minutes or whatever. But it was just funny to kind
Yeah.
of see
Very
that
fitting.
that monkey mind going like, "Oh, is it? I have 5 more minutes. Can I? Should I make sure I have some water? Or should I double check that my headphones are charged for the call?" And it's just
Mm.
what our mind
To
does, right?
control the world around you. Yeah.
Yeah, because I want it to,
Mm.
of course, I want it to go well. I want to have, I want to be prepared, and I want it to
Mm.
work out, and that's okay. Everybody wants to have that. but to not let that just,
Hmm.
control your life. Because the other thing is too, more times than not, shit's going to go wrong, right? Um, so it's it's that's when you get your mind that wants it to go right, it starts to freak out, right? Because it,
Yeah.
it wants to control, and then that can really get wound up and just go off, you know, snowball into something that
Yes.
so the kind of the Buddhist description would be that's why we have war. Nobody ever
Yes.
started saying I want to have uh, um, major conflicts or something like that, but it just one little I want this versus versus accepting the conditions as they arise
Mhm.
kind of snowballs into terrible things that we have to engage in with life, right?
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting, and that takes me on two separate paths that I want to kind of pursue. So I'll
Uh-huh.
try to go back to the first one, and then come back to the topic of war, because I think it's a wonderful worst case scenario to evaluate through the lenses of
Right.
some of the things that we've been talking about. The first of which is the amount of control, and I agree. People are people across the globe, and I think that's one of the truths that I want to get to is that regardless of the Eastern or Western or somewhere in between school of thought that we classify ourselves into, the reality is that people are animals that are first and foremost concerned with their own survival. And one of the ways we do that is to develop heuristics. I wanted to look up the word, I had forgotten it, the psychological shortcuts to be able to
Right.
analyze an infinite
Yep.
amount of data around
Yep.
us
Yep.
and to be able to dial in into only the most significant data so that we can make appropriate decisions that will enable the future survival of ourselves and therefore our
Right.
offsprings and yada yada yada.
Yeah.
But
Get away from the tiger
the
hiding in the
problem
bushes.
is, yes, the problem with that comes in where it is an inherently and admittedly flawed system in that there is an infinite amount of data. Because we dial it into only a few variables of the infinite number doesn't mean that those variables don't exist. Well, what does the human mind do with that? Oftentimes we ignore it. What I think the really, really nuanced and deep thinkers of both schools, if you will, you know, recognize that that infinite world around us is still playing a part and that we really can't control it. Um, with the spirituality of the Judeo-Christian realm is, this all of those things exist in a spiritual realm that we can't necessarily see, taste, touch, but they're there and they're affecting us just as real as everything else. And in the Zen Buddhist world, it is that we're just one thing in an infinite particle of things, and we're actually all connected, but we're all distinct. And these kind of the duality that you talk about, that is all, that's all well and good, but if I'm driving the car, to use your analogy, and I'm daydreaming about that all the time, like I'm likely going to crash because I'm not focused on the world around us. And pain is, I think, a beautiful tool for us to be able uh, to be able to ground us in the here and now. However, through that pain, sometimes that we can allow that pain to prevent us from reaching that higher plane, if you will, and the recognition of the like opening up our purview to those variables around us. Um, it blinds us to it, or we can use it to be able to see through it. So one thing I think is really interesting about if you look at Jesus and you look at Siddhartha Buddha, kind of the two uh, chosen chosen ones, if you will, representatives of those schools of thought. They both did a lot of the same things in order to find what they considered the ultimate truth, whether that be a lack of truth or not a truth, or they both went into the desert and fasted for 40 days. What did Buddha? He sat on like freezing ground for 40 days and starved himself. Christ went out in the desert after he was baptized to put themselves in um, a physically painful environment so that they could reach a higher plane to know that truth, to take themselves out of the bubble of like, I need to survive as an animal and reach out into this infinite plane around us. And that's something I think is really interesting. Now, and that's where I think we can, in my mind, they don't exist on opposite ends of the spectrum. They are the same. It's more
Yeah,
like a circle and less like a line.
I think there's some like existential variations between kind of the worldview that's developed. Um, Now, I'm definitely, I was raised, Christian Catholic, so I definitely had a lot of explorations in that. and I think there are ways. There's been times in my life where I've looked back on some Christian writings and kind of held them with some Zen writings that I were looking at, and I was like, you can take some words here and you put Jesus there and you put Buddha there, and it's like they're saying the same thing. Um, there are also times when they're distinctly not saying the same thing. So like Buddha did
Mm.
go for 40 days or some amount of time. There was a similar story where he you know uh, was an ascetic is the term they would use in kind of the Indian jargon, Indian religious jargon. He was starving himself, and was they said when he did reach um, when he was doing these practices, you could see his spine because he had been fasting for so long. His um, teaching of the middle way was actually saying you don't need to do that. That's too far to one end of the spectrum. Now he will
After he
also
had gone to that end.
right,
Yeah.
right, right. So again, it was part of the process. So you know,
Mm.
um, now he also, it's not as though he's saying, to be a wealthy king, you have to be a wealthy king to be uh, uh, enlightened or
Mm.
whatever word you want to use. Um, so there's also the idea of a self, which might be analogous to the soul in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
There,
I think
there
that's fair.
is there's no self or no soul in Buddhism. Um, there are Eastern uh, religions that have, Hinduism. There's, I've spent some time studying that as well. There is a soul. They have, teachings of rebirth and going on to heaven, and or the
Nirvana.
equivalent of that. Yeah. Um, so in Buddhism, the kind of the one of the core teachings, another one that this when I was kind of talking to you about the ultimate truth or objective truth kind of thing. Um, there there's some teachers. Nagarjuna is a good one, who's an Indian philosopher that was 500 years or so after the Buddha, and a lot of the Buddhist traditions sometimes refer to him as the second coming of the Buddha, just for how
Mm.
profound his teachings were. And he kind of was able to put it into language that is kind of appealing to philosophers and thinkers and logicians and things like that. But some of the teachings are very subtle, and these ideas of true and false, it kind of plays with the polarity there of um, even the idea of me being Shaun and me being a thing is a construction in my mind. Um,
Mm-hmm.
my identity, and it's so. What's it been? I don't know how long's it been since we've seen each other in person? But 5 years, longer, maybe
Probably
10 years or
6 or 7 years. Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
Every cell in your body is a new cell, right?
Yeah. After like
Uh,
30 or 40 days or something like that.
right. And even the
Yeah.
longest one,
You're a
like
completely
your
different
bones are
person.
like 7 years or so, even the longest. So like the
Mm-hmm.
piece of you, the material of you isn't you, and the material
Mm-hmm.
of me isn't me. So what is that? And now again, the Christian teaching would have there's the soul, and it doesn't maybe get into that. And I'm not really trying to speak to that right now. I'm just getting to the idea of in Buddhism, you're kind of always a
Mm-hmm.
composite of things. Uh, each situation, each entity. Often the imagery of a chariot is used, because it was back in um, uh, hundreds of years ago, right? At what point does it, or thousands of years ago, even that these teachings were happened, so chariots. So, at what point does a chariot become a chariot, right? You have the certain pieces of wood,
Yeah.
connected together, and the nails, and you have the horses attached to them, and you have the seats, and you have, at what point is it a chariot, right? For one
Yeah.
today is, what's at what point if you chop up some wood and nail it together to make a table, at what point does it go from being a tree to being a table, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of these images are used to kind of describe that we kind of ascribe these concepts to these things in the world, that might not actually be there. There's not like an inherent nature to there's no tableness to the table, right? Um, and there's no treeness to the tree. Because if a tree was essentially a tree, it could only be a tree. If you then chop it down and create a table, it's like, well, then
How
how
does it
did
become
you,
something
right?
else?
And then you can get into this idea of atomizing with, chopping down with an axe and all that,
Hmm.
shift changing it and things like that, which, I'm I'm not I wouldn't say I'm capable of fully engaging in that dialogue, and nor would we want to spend the amount of time to do that. But there are people that have gone through this and looked at, if you analytically break things down, you can come to this place where you can
Hmm.
kind of see that uh, there is no self, there is no permanence to the self. Now, and kind of one thing you had brought up was like, well, is that nihilism? Right? Is that there's nothing there?
Yeah.
And that's too far as well, right?
It's not the middle way. Well, thank you
Right,
actually for bringing that up because that's one thing I want to make sure that we touch on
right,
because especially in American culture today is that
right. Uh-huh.
the recognition that hey, maybe we've oversimplified the world around us and we've bracketed things too much in order to make them controllable, and because of that we've lost some of the truth that lies, that third side of the coin. We've lost it because we wanted to make a
Right,
simple two-sided analogy.
right, right,
um, you know that lends itself to the Western ideology of nihilism, which is that, well, nothing really matters because nothing really is.
right,
Therefore, it's just kind of all at a
right,
whim. There's no real
right,
way to quantify things.
right.
And the concern I have with that is the result of that can often be a lack of value placed on other people, or a deterioration of what we would consider moral good or moral
Yep,
bad. So
yep.
how does Eastern thought really
So
differentiate from that, or does it?
my understanding, so if I were, I was um, kind of brushing up on some of the Nagarjuna um, or Nagarjuna um, teachings, is it's kind of like you're somebody is saying something, right? This is what's true, right? They're putting something out there, and nihilists are saying no, that's not true. It has no value, right? But the nihilists are putting something out there, right? Like you're saying that has no
Yeah.
value
the whole
is
the whole never speak in absolutes. They miss
right,
the
right.
irony of
Well, if
the
you
statement.
apply nihilism to its own philosophy, it has no meaning, right?
Hmm.
It's kind of like there's a paradoxical. Um, so Buddhism kind of acknowledges this paradox and says, don't go too far either way. It's like if you were to say this statement is false, right? So
Hmm.
if this statement is false, if it's true, that makes it false. If that's false, it makes it true. It's a paradox, right?
Hmm.
Um, so that's kind of an example of like when you look at these duality uh, inherent in something, there's limits
Hmm.
that words have at that place. Even right now, struggling to find the words
You're
to
struggling to describe the
describe the
ineffable.
paradox,
And
right? It's
yes.
and that's what the paradox is for, is to say this statement is false, right? And you
Hmm.
kind of then you look at it, and again, that's what you look at it from a different angle, and it's not that there's this objective truth buried at the bottom of the statement. It's more so
Hmm.
freeing you to see that you don't need to like obsess over finding it. And again, going back to like that nihilism versus somebody that's like putting out some objective truth, if they're sitting there arguing about no, it's nihilism is true, and you know someone else is saying no, the existence of the soul or whatever, yada yada yada.
Hmm.
Um, or maybe you could also just be there and not say anything, right? That's actually a way to engage that crowd or that conversation, right?
Right.
Now you could be there not saying anything, um, and you're just an idiot in the crowd, right? That could be a way to arrive. Um, or you could be there saying, there could be a sage in the crowd too that is just saying, I have nothing to add to this conversation because there's no words I can put that would be helpful, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, how the idiot and the sage, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between the two, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
This very example is a paradox, right? they're
Hmm.
communicating the same thing, but there's a subtle difference, right? If you have, in this metaphor I'm giving, if you have the idiot in the crowd that's kind of just staring there, not saying anything, we understand that there's a difference to how that person is engaging in this like conversation
Hmm.
of objective truth, as opposed to the sage that might be sitting there just listening. And there's things they could say. They could probably prove the nihilist wrong in a couple sentences, or even write a whole book of why the nihilist is wrong. And they could also put some supporting arguments, right? Or they could,
Hmm.
the person that's speaking to existence, they could say a bunch of things to support their arguments, or say a bunch of things or one thing to refute their arguments, right? Or they could
Hmm.
just sit there and be quiet on the subject because they might be acknowledging that this might be a subject we can't speak to.
Hmm. Yeah, there's an ineffable quality about that, the infinite nature of the things that we're discussing.
Right,
And it is quite humbling and oftentimes frightening, which is why I don't think a lot of people do it.
right,
To recognize that no matter what words you say, like as beautiful as language has evolved to be, and as refined as we can make a point on the end of a sentence or a single phrase or word, uh, it never fully quite uh, captures the everything that's there. The whole picture's worth a thousand words. I mean, when you're in love, we'll take love as a great example. Like there's no words to describe it. I mean, we call it love, right?
right,
But the variations of the type of love and the moments of love and the experience of love, it's ever changing. So how can you ever quantify that in a way
right,
that's stagnant on the written word? I mean, by the time you say it, it's already evolved, it's changed,
right,
and that's quite frightening because, well, how do I build cities or towns or a
right,
relationship or
right.
put one foot in front of the other when I realize the complexity of all of this? I think it's often like I think you see it a lot. An easy example is when people start to watch or read about the infinite nature and just the scale of the universe. So when
Mhm.
we're talking about things outside of the Earth, it's really easy to get to a point where you're just like you're literally awestruck by
Yeah,
the scope of everything. And what do you do in that moment? How do you even begin to, make heads or tails? Go back to the coin
right.
of the something of that magnitude. Um, I would say the idiot and the sage is a beautifully um, stated analogy because to the external or to the viewer, yeah, it's almost impossible to tell a difference, but there is a difference, and
Right,
that is really where I think the heart of my understanding and desire to seek truth is knowing that I will ultimately fail because my life is finite. My intelligence and my ability to comprehend is finite, as is all of ours, even collectively, as much greater as it might be in the collective than it is in the individual. It is somehow limited to a power or something greater, whatever you want to call that, a god or the being or nothing or no thing. It is it's really fascinating. Well, look,
mhm.
Shaun, to keep our viewers from crashing into the cars in
Yeah,
front of them,
right.
let's call knock it off there. I really appreciate you